You can't not respect the skill of the lifts when you're a competitor, because if you do, you're just going to get hurt. You're probably going to want to use variability just as a means of regressing the total amount of load on the system. You know, if someone lays out for a third attempt and fails, it's not a technique issue. Their technique isn't breaking down. It's just their strength is breaking down. Dude, you put 3-meter wraps on and squat more than you can actually squat, and you're worried about shear force on a quad extension? Like, be real. You can't afford to have the same athlete come in at the same skill level, the same conditioning, the same strength every season, because the baseline level of skill is increasing. Just like you don't want to leave all your money in the bank account because the inflation is actually causing your money to be worth less. The idea that you're going to punch a landmine and your landmine presses are going to increase your punching power is like, what? Are you fucking joking me? What universe is that? How the human, like, no.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch, and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. How did you first encounter powerlifting?
Yeah, really good question. I was in chiropractic college in South San Francisco area, Silicon Valley. I would have been 2012. I had a classmate of mine, it was Tony Rogers, and he was trying to like bug me to get into it. I always like squat, bench, and deadlifted just out of training for sport, and then started training for like hypertrophy. And I got like decently strong before I got into it. And then I went to, actually, it was like a West Side barbell inspired multi-ply gym called Wild Iron. It's not there anymore, and maybe that's for the best. And my buddy Tony Rogers kind of dragged me in there one day, and then I just started kind of training more squat, bench, and dead specific. And just by proxy of living in the Bay Area, I got hooked up with a dude named Dan Green, and that was basically the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the beginning. I don't know, it depends on how you want to look at it.
Yeah, how has your perspective changed on the sport since you first started, practicing, competing, training?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty lucky to be able to train where I trained when I was like really competing heavily. I think, I don't know if much has changed in the sport. My perspective has changed because I have a different vantage point of it. Like, I was indoctrinated from a very purist perspective. Like, Dan would read a lot of old like Russian training manuals, and he was very, he's well read, outside of just the world of powerlifting, but very, social media was an afterthought in that gym, like to the point where if you brought in some fancy camera, you were asked to leave. Yeah, no, seriously, like, yeah, you'd film a set here and there, but like, it was probably one of the, it's funny, people talk about like the strongest gyms in the West. It was the strongest gym in the world when I was there. There'd be often nights where I was, the only person without a world record training in like the group of 5 or 6 of us. So I don't know. My perspective, I guess, is just I've started to see it from maybe for what it is or what it's become, like social media has really been a driving force, for better or for worse. It's changed powerlifting, I think, for always. So, I see the marketing side of it more. I see people who like more or less exploit the sport for monetary gain, and the byproduct of that is we have more people in the sport of powerlifting than when I started. But it was very much like a purist perspective when, and I think more importantly where I started. I'm sure there were places that were more heavily into social media around the powerlifting world at that time, but it just wasn't a thing where I first got indoctrinated to it. So yeah, it was, again, it's something I look back on, and it was a very unique time and place, like to have Dan Green, Andrew Herbert, Christy Hawkins, Emily Hu under the same roof, which is every world record from 242, 220, 165 female, 123 or 124, and 113. Like they were the Mount Rushmore across those weight categories. So it was pretty neat, man. Like definitely a unique time to be at that gym.
Yeah, and so that brings us to today, powerlifting in 2021. You mentioned the impact of social media and how it's probably brought a lot of people to the sport with more visibility. And do you see any impact from CrossFit into powerlifting?
Yeah, I mean, CrossFit was sort of this, it gave exposure to Olympic weightlifting. It just gave exposure to the barbell, I guess, more broadly speaking. So CrossFit was definitely a huge catalyst for powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, different types of like aerobic based training, metabolic conditioning. This Metcon is sort of like their thing. I think it brought a lot of people to exercise, and then it allowed them to maybe find sub-disciplines that they leaned on more heavily. Gymnastics as another one that comes to mind. In a similar way, I would compare it to like the way the UFC has probably gained a lot of popularity in sub-disciplines of martial arts, like wrestling and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing even. UFC kind of brought all of these sub-disciplines to the forefront. Is still very marketable, but you're starting to see the sub-disciplines start to fill up with people who may not like a certain aspect of mixed martial arts, but really gravitate towards another. So I think really similar relationship as CrossFit to different sub-disciplines of the barbell, similar to UFC to different sub-disciplines of mixed martial arts.
And you talked about how powerlifting has evolved in terms of popularity. How has the perspective of people changed about powerlifting in everyday gyms, in your traditional gym setting? What do you see now versus what did you maybe see or not see some years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I've consulted with a handful of gyms that historically were, anywhere there could be a machine, there was a machine, right? So now you're seeing gyms wipe out entire like parts of their cardio sections to put in these large rigs and squat racks and turfs and platforms. The idea that you'd have like a 5x12 square purely to just put a barbell on with weights in commercial gym settings was like, pretty inefficient, or seen as a very inefficient use of your space 10 years ago. Now it's something that, a prospective member might look for. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely brought like barbell to the masses, and we vote with our attention, we vote with our dollars. So people were gravitating to places that were, that just had that empty space and a few barbells, some wooden boxes, and a chin-up bar. So commercial gyms wised up, and they started to make these things more accessible, which as recently as 10 years ago, the thought of seeing configurations that we see now in a commercial gym setting was just unfathomable.
How do you see, or how would you advise that people, or recommend that people use the three big lifts, the squat, deadlift, and bench, if they maybe don't have a competitive aspiration with the sport, but they want to stay fit, they want to be healthy, they want to maybe drop a little bit of weight, like you said, those movements, powerlifting as such has grown in popularity, and people are starting to be open to the idea of lifting weights, and that, you know, it's not going to make you bulky if you're a woman, but there's lots of positive aspects to it. So where would you draw that distinction between someone who wants to be competitive and someone who doesn't? For the person who doesn't, what's the best way to approach those lifts and use them in your training?
Yeah, I mean, for people who aren't going to be competitive, I think you really need to take into respect the skill of the lifts, which a lot of times is, you know, that's diminished in a competitive sense. But you can't not respect the skill of the lifts when you're a competitor, because if you do, you're just gonna get hurt. Like, there's no two ways about it. Like, if you don't know how to wield a barbell properly, and you're going for max efforts and you're programming off sub-maximal intensity, like, you're just not going to be competitive for very long. So when people get into it, it's like, understand like an onboarding, like understand like a skill progression that might better lead you to these three lifts as an end goal. But no, that's probably not going to be your starting point. Like, you know, probably wouldn't have someone the first day in the gym go through an SPD session. And that flies in the face of some common convention. But I think it's, you know, they're just movements constrained, like they're basically taxonomies of movement, right? Squatting patterns can exist anywhere from a heels elevated goblet squat to a low bar squat, which is like a huge range of, you know, deviation of center of mass, how we sequentially load the hips, knees, and back, but they're all considered squats. So just understanding like how it is that you could incrementally progress to these, and understand further how to concurrently train those progressions for all three. Like, I don't think a Gen Pop person, if given, you know, maybe I'm being a little bit like diminutive to the general population, but given the demands of your recovery alone, and given the limitations of like, you know, lifestyle, nutrition, sleep, and all the other habits that go into recovering adequately from a competitive standpoint, like, I would say probably best to focus on like one lift as like a primary, and then find maybe more like higher output, less demand for internal stability, like maybe even that's machines or something like that, to act as a placeholder in lieu of training the other two lifts at the competition standard. But I think it should always be the goal. I think it should always be the goal to work towards a proficiency and skill that'll allow you to train all three. But if you get really good at all three, like even me, if I'm training, you know, if I'm training for a meet, I'm probably not going to be doing squat, bench, and deadlift in the same training cycle, unless that is like something that looks like the last, you know, 6 to 8 weeks prior to a competition, just because the demand is so high. And so if you're, you know, you got a couple of kids and you got a wife and you got a mortgage and a boss that's up your fucking tree, it's like, maybe, you know, if general health is the goal, then they could just be used as tools, but I don't think they all need to be used at once.
Yeah. So you talked about the different progressions to take you towards those lifts, so to those lifts. Do you use prerequisites when you work with people? What hoops or what stages do they have to go through before they can, you know, get a bar on their back or get a bar from the floor?
Right. Yeah. I mean, let's start with squatting, because that's probably most common and most contentious. Like, I look at unilateral progressions first, and where people rest in their ability to overcome like unilateral movements, or like gait cycle movements, single leg stuff, whatever, however you want to reduce it. That'll indicate what skill we start at. So if, like, you know, a stationary lunge is challenging, like organizing yourself with literally just one foot in front of the other and reaching something that looks like adequate hip and knee flexion. If you can't do that with one leg, why would I then take that, both of those legs that can't do that individually, and ask them to do it simultaneously? So yeah, like stationary lunges, walking lunges, some single leg hinging if we're getting into more like posterior load, higher to low bar squats. It's something that just tests the ability for the hip joint and the pelvis and spine to resist force. Like getting a baseline measure of how each one of those things acts in isolation without, you know, the other limb there to support it structurally, without being able to create this like A-frame ladder that's in hide and mask a lot of functional deficiencies or inadequacies. So, you know, a lot of times when you peel this model back, it's like you leave people far away from the actual barbell itself. Oftentimes early squatting progressions are going to be counterbalance or goblet, more anteriorly loaded, trying to adopt, not necessarily a strong knee bias, but getting people into the habit of, using their knees as they squat rather than just turning their squat into a hinge, which is often the case for people who, are just learning how to squat. So putting them in like a counterbalance position, prompting a more upright torso. And then as we scale the position of the load from counterbalance to goblet to front to high to low, that shift of the combined center of mass of the lifter and the barbell or the lifter and the kettlebell or the weight, whatever you want to use, that going from out front to on your back, that's going to incrementally force your torso into a slightly more bent position or slightly more forward lean position. And that's one of the biggest things that you'll have to grade, because that's going to put more demand on the hip. It's going to put more demand on the pelvis and the spine. So using a progression of unilateral movements and pairing the competency of those unilateral movements with a regressed squatting pattern. So if you can't do a stationary lunge, you don't get a barbell, right? You get a 2.5 kilo plate at arm's length, and I might even elevate your heels. Or you get TRX straps, or fucking hold on to my hands and I'll be the counterbalance. That's probably like a very Cole's Notes version of a progression that I'll use for like a more gen pop application. And then hinging, it's very similar, honestly, because I think the hinge starts where the squat should end. So why this, different torso sizes are going to dictate your mechanics. I say you should never have a combined center of mass of you and a lifter that forces to keep the mass over the midfoot by hinging first. So if I'm in a position where I have to not break in my knees, like, look, if I'm in a counterbalance squat with most people, they can break in their knees first. They don't have to throw their hips back. They might have to throw their hips back early into the lift, but not exclusively out of the gate. If I'm in a low bar position, my bar goes as low as I can possibly put it while still initiating with my squat, my hips and my knees at the same time. The second that bar is so low that a break in the knee simultaneous with the break in the hip causes me to lose my balance, the bar is just simply too low. And we see this a lot with people trying to maximize leverage and not really understanding biomechanics. It's like, well, if the bar is way down below my rear delt, this is the distance I have to move, and this is why my chest has to be so forward. But it's like, that's just a deadlift with a bar on your back. And so the second the knees are out of the equation and the initiation of the squat, we're no longer squatting, we're hinging, right? So in understanding like where the hinge starts and where the deadlift, or where the squat ends and where the hinge starts, I think is really integral, because how close someone is to loading their spine in their squatting pattern will dictate the amount of fatigue and interference in the recovery when it comes to the hinging patterns. So a hinging progression in isolation in a vacuum where we're not concurrently training a deadlift would just be scaling their ability to stabilize their spine in a more shear force position with the chest more parallel to the floor. So this could be something like, I like starting with like a rope hinge, having the vector pull from a cable stack in front of them rather than pure axial, teaching them to externally rotate their shoulders and extend to use their lats to stabilize their lumbar spine. That's usually where I'll start, maybe switching that intent to dumbbells into maybe like a trap bar into like a block pull, maybe like a mid shin, and then off the floor. So all we're doing is we're just taking their torso and we're just doing this, right? That's every movement is just incrementally increasing the torso angle and allowing them to move through this eccentric excursion first, so we can learn how to paint that concentric on the way up, right? Because it's the one lift that starts with the concentric phase, right? Bench press and squatting start with an eccentric phase, which allows you to learn under less consequence during the rep. Like, oh, I'm going to be coming back to this point, like a backswing in golf. It's like, I want my club head to track very similar on the way back as I do on the follow through. It's the same with the squat and the bench, where it's like you can groove your concentric by navigating the eccentric, where you're on average 30% stronger. In the deadlift, you aren't given that. So we use that progression as a sense of incrementally, with exercise selection, grooving that eccentric portion of the movement, so that when we get to the bar on the floor, we have an awareness of how our body is meant to act and react through this entire arc of the movement.
Do you have a similar progression for the bench press, or do you operate a little bit differently there?
Well, the bench press having the external support of the bench and being horizontally loaded or having a torso that's horizontal really changes a lot of the rules, because our spine no longer has to be priority number one when it comes to stabilization, because it's already supported.
Mm.
I like to work in the overhead plane first with people. I like to get their shoulders functioning to a point where we can get them overhead without compensating through flaring a rib cage, compromising the lumbar spine. So it's basic progressions through like rotator cuff function, really, serratus anterior, creating that upward rotation, maybe even expanding the rib cage slightly posteriorly, teaching them how to shift their center of mass backwards. Because the bench press is a really good way to express function of the shoulder, but it's not a good way to expose it to function of the shoulder because it is so externally supported. So that caveat of the bench makes it unique in the sense of the way that like I would on-ramp it, although not entirely different to using, gait cycle progressions for squatting. Getting through a full range of flexion and then the subsequent rotation that happens at different degrees of flexion would be kind of where I would start with most people. I wouldn't just go like, let's do machines for a bit. Let's do dumbbells for a bit. Let's do barbell. I'd probably look a little bit deeper at like the ones and zeros. Like, what's your source code of movement look like at your glenohumeral joint, at your scapulothoracic joint? And need to a certain degree, like how is your rib cage mechanics going to dictate your shoulder mechanics and on the whole? And then how can we make some incremental improvements at all of these points to have a summative improvement that allows us to operate with a very high, like a high margin for error, right? And so if I can make sure that we're good in the overhead, we can, maintain unstable loads and unstable positions. When I come back to this much more stable joint position on a much more stable medium with the external stability of the bench, I know I'm expressing the function that I have, not masking this function by this external support. Which is often the case if people, they succumb to some sort of injury or they're not progressing from a performance standpoint the way we would expect, because we really aren't taking a look under the hood before we put them on the barbell or put them on a dyno and really kind of see how far they can run. It's like you might redline that engine pretty quickly if you don't tune it before you put it on the track, sort of thing. So that's when I look at bench press, I'd sort of think, all right, the major caveat to it is the bench itself. But ultimately, it's like, let's see how well we can get the shoulders to function. Let's test them at their end ranges. Let's push those end ranges. Let's build, a capacity or an ability to stabilize in these end ranges. And then when we bring it back down to, this lesser degree of shoulder flexion, we know we're operating with a higher degree of proficiency. Let's not even say safety. Let's just say proficiency.
Yeah, talking about proficiency and safety, I guess you mentioned the importance of technique in the execution of the lifts and longevity and performance. Were you always aware of the importance of technique when lifting? Was that ingrained from the very start with you, or did you maybe have to learn it the hard way through some injuries?
Yes and yes. I started training, for sport, ice hockey primarily, and I had a really good. My training partner was very, very like ahead of his time, smart. And I was decently well read on like the technique and squat, bench, and deadlift. I was usually bench in the past for more like hypertrophy specific adaptations, although looking back, probably not the greatest tool to use and not something that I deploy often in my training, if at all, for hypertrophy benefits. But yeah, I think like technique was something ingrained, but again, the margin for error becomes much less as you start to manage more and more weight. So, I've had a handful of injuries like in my, like in a few meet preps. I tore my right pec pretty nasty back in, I want to say like January of 2018, maybe 2019. And just, misgroove one rep. That's all it took, right? Like It doesn't take when you're playing with fire like that and you're really pushing. It was my last bench before would have been the Arnold Classic in Australia. It was my last bench session before I was going to leave for Melbourne, and I misgrooved a rep high. It was too much stretch in the pec, and then I was like, all right, let's see how this goes, and it just ripped. It fucking sucked, but. Yeah, it's definitely something that I was aware of going in. technique is always something that I've sort of held to a very high order in all my training styles, whether it was athletic, whether it was aesthetic, or whether it was for powerlifting and just like more strength based. But you really learn. I'm a different lifter after that than I was before. That's for sure.
Are there any things that you changed in your approach to technique along your journey in powerlifting? Maybe some subtleties that you weren't aware of in the first place, or that you developed over time that maybe changed things a little bit for you?
Yeah, I definitely, there's some things, squatting cues. I'm a decently upright squatter for like a guy my size. I I started to do away with the knees out cue pretty quickly
Mm-hmm.
in my powerlifting career, just realizing that I wasn't actually driving force into the ground when I came on the outside of my foot and it started to supinate. So I guess maybe one of the things that I would begin to internally cue is if I couldn't fix a movement by just cueing my feet and my hands, I regress the movement. Right. So that was kind of a thing for me where it's like if my foot position was off and I was over supinating and trying to fix that by allowing pronation to occur didn't fix the lift, I wasn't going to do that lift. Right. If for whatever reason, if I was doing back accessory work, if I was doing pressing accessory work, if I couldn't get the position I needed by just manipulating the position of my hand and like understanding that the position of my hand is indicative of the position of my shoulder, understanding that the position of my foot through pronation and supination is an expression of my position of my hip. If I couldn't get the fix I was looking for by just focusing very peripherally at the hand and foot, I would just regress the movement. I think as you get more proficient at the big lifts, that's when variability starts to come in. Exercise variability is a highly contentious topic in powerlifting. But I think the context that always is lacking from these debates is at what stage of lifting, at what level of skill, right? Novice, variability is probably only going to be seen in exercises that should allow you to drive a certain amount of hypertrophy, right? Where specificity in learning the skill of the movement is paramount, and that efficiency in learning the skill will allow you to ultimately lift more weight. Mm-hmm. Once you kind of become an intermediate and you're no longer a beginner, you probably want to stick fairly specific, but not as specific as when you first started. But once you're an advanced lifter, you're probably going to want to use variability just as a means of regressing the total amount of load on the system, right? Like sometimes I front squat, not for any particular application. It's going to bias more erectors, it's going to bias more quads, to allow me to stay a little bit more upright. But I'm front squatting because I can just work with a front squat and have to use far less load than if I was trying to work year round with my back squat, right? I'll close grip bench, not because it's a tricep thing, because I just need to press, and I don't want to be pressing year round in a competition grip that allows me to push 67 or 80+% of my submaximal volume. So it's like, I think exercise variability comes into play at different points in your lifting career based off of your skill. So for me, it was really more about understanding how my skill level progressed. And as I understood how my skill level progressed, it was really more a change of the exercise itself and not necessarily a big stark change in my exercise execution of my competition list.
Yeah. Would you say that, is there one of the two that you see more often in terms of whether it's people going too quickly to a lot of variety relative to their performance level, or is it people sticking with quote unquote the basics for too long? Is there one that's more around than the other ones?
Well, I think sticking to basics for too long, because most people in powerlifting are novice, which is, like any sport, most people who play basketball are not in the NBA.
Yeah.
The majority of NBA players are not the majority of basketball players. So I would say that, because you can get very good results from higher frequency, attenuate, whether it's daily undulated periodization programs based off of RPE, but higher specificity is very beneficial in the early stages of training. So I feel like people have a hard time shedding that program that increased their bench, 20, 30 kilos, increase their total, 50 kilos or, 75 kilos, 100 kilos, whatever. They have a hard time ditching that because it took them from point A to point B, but not realizing that point B isn't the final destination. And you need to adopt a new style of lifting if you want to break through to the next level. So I would say that the bigger issue I see based purely off of numbers, because the majority of people who are into this are at a more novice intermediate level, and there's less people who are at an elite level, is because to get from intermediate to elite, you likely need to change what got you from novice to intermediate. And that's where people really struggle. And, they run these higher frequency, I guess overall higher volume as a consequence of the frequency programs that are good at building skill. And they run them at weights they demand a certain level of recovery that is different than when they first started running it. And then they just end up in this cycle where they can't seem to get any purchase because they keep on the same program.
Yeah, that makes sense. On this topic of, demands as a competitor, demands changing as you progress, as you evolve. Can you talk about training to failure and how different that might look for a novice, for an intermediate lifter, and for an advanced lifter? Is there a place for it? If so, in what context?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the training to failure one is just another thing that lacks a lot of context. So the context, in my opinion, around training to failure is understanding what's failing, right? Like failure for a novice is different than failure as an elite lifter. So like a novice will fail technically, right? An inability to likely just create the co-contractions necessary to maintain technique within a lift. So whereas, if someone lays out for a third attempt and fails, it's not a technique issue. Their technique isn't breaking down. It's just their strength is breaking down, right? And that's ultimately what we're looking for. We don't want to fail, but we want to come as close to it as possible. But understanding failure as a reference point and how that reference point is different for some people. As far as training to failure, I don't think it has a place in novice lifting for sure, because we want to make sure that practice is of a high skill and very reproducible. Intermediate to advanced, I think training to failure can be useful for lifters that are a little bit, I'm just going to say it, lifters that are a little bit soft mentally. I think like letting a guy get pinned and realizing that he's going to be okay affords him a certain level of freedom to actually be able to send it. Because I see people as like, what failed, and this again, failure is a different reference point for some people. What failed was their mind, right? And not actually, because I know guys when they fail, it's like, like I lifted with Dan, the classic example. Like he pulls what looks like anyone else's 1 rep max, and he goes in for 6 more reps. Like his ability, like if he fails, it's you can believe that it is a system failure. It's not a coordination failure. It's not a mental toughness failure. So, prescribing things to failure is a very, for me anyways, in my perspective around training, is a very rare thing. And it might just be strategically done to break someone and just then allow them to be like, hey man, like it's okay. Like you're safe. It's fine to fail. And then, it's like wearing, it's like if you wear a helmet, you're never going to crash your bike. But the second you don't, you will, sort of thing. So it's like it's giving them that helmet to be like, oh, like look, if I go down, I go down, and that freedom is. And oftentimes you see it with like if you ask for a spot and then you just smoke the rep. It's like because you're safe, it actually allows you to push more. So it's that idea. So aside from that, failure I think should just be dedicated to more hypertrophy work. Like if you're doing your tricep extension with reps and reserves, like what the fuck are you doing? Like, do you want small arms for the rest of your life? Like it's a single joint movement. Like not that the tricep is a single joint, but a tricep extension. I just don't want people getting up me on the anatomy. I know the tricep crosses 2 joints. Output movements, leg press, quad extensions, the more isolated the movement, the more externally stabilized, the more freedom you should have to push it, because there's minimal skill required in a preacher curl. So if you want to fucking take it to the house, then you're more than licensed to do that. So I think failure because I see a lot of lifters taking their compounds to failure and then leaving reps in reserve on their tricep extension.
Yeah,
And they have
backwards.
small arms and shitty totals.
um, you talked about adding or maybe focusing maybe more of the failure or to failure work on the smaller movements, the accessory work. At what point is it for someone? Let's take a beginner in the sport of powerlifting. They want to compete. Maybe they've had one or two meets, but they still have a lot of potential to exploit and to grow. How early do you introduce accessory, bodybuilding type work? How much of it is a good idea to start with in the beginning? Is there things you don't want to be doing too early so that you don't kind of, rob them twice, as in you want to give them the time to get that incremental progress over time. You don't want to give them the complex stuff or the more advanced stuff too early. How do you progress those accessory work over time?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's what you can recover from. And as much as you can recover from is what should be prescribed. And like a really good indicator of that, especially in early stages, is as long as their compounds keep moving, as long as progression is seen, and it doesn't have to be on a micro level, but like at least on a macro perspective, in regards to like macro cycles, as long as I'm seeing their squat, bench, and dead or whatever variation, again, likely not going to be doing much variability. As long as those main lifts are moving, again, as far as increasing in weight or increasing in like density or some sort of stimulus, as long as we're adapting to those, I'm going to keep on layering on more accessory work, right? Like you don't need to recover from bicep curls, but I've also never met a guy that bench over 600 pounds that has small biceps, right? So it's like, these are things that are setting the stage to have a work capacity to actually build yourself to an intermediate level. Like 3 times body weight deadlift is not cool when you weigh 140 pounds as a male. No one cares. No one cares. Zero people care. Because it is ultimately powerlifting and people are interested in the big and strong guys. So like the relative strength thing, albeit impressive, is for me not what I'm in it for, right? So taking a strong hypertrophy focus, whether it's in a particular training block or concurrently in a block, it kind of depends on the individual's ability to recover and what interference that could, like, am I going to smoke someone's lats the day before a bench day if they're like a big arch bencher? Probably not. So there are considerations that you can make in the micro, like on the day to day and the week to week, to better like concurrently train for both. But as much as it's like eating have you ever had like a diet coach or had someone do your nutrition and be like, vegetables are free calories. If you're hungry, just eat vegetables. That's kind of like hypertrophy. It's like, if you can manage it, then do it. And like, I think there's huge implications, not to oversimplify it. There's huge implications on hypertrophy style training in maintaining joint integrity, right? Like there are bicep variations that I'll use specifically for a powerlifter, and not specifically for a powerlifter, but I'll be very specific in the variations I use for hypertrophy, because there is secondary and tertiary and quaternary benefits to different movements. Like a preacher curl, I'm probably never going to do with a powerlifter. Makes no sense. A high cable bicep curl, getting that upward rotation, integrating that serratus anterior, an incline bicep curl, driving more shoulder extension. Tell how many fucking powerlifters complain of bicep tendonitis from squatting, and it's like, why? What is it? Why? You're trying to extend your shoulder and flex your elbow, and this is an issue. It's like, why don't you do an exercise that extends your shoulder and flexes your elbow? That seems pretty simple to me. So yeah, I think hypertrophy is really going to be what builds your base, but not just from a sense of having a lot of muscle, but allowing you to start to far surpass the joint positions needed for your big three and build a relative buffer zone at your shoulders, at your hips, at your spine, at your knees, at your elbows. Right? Everyone complains about their elbows hurting, but no one ever does an elbow day. Like, just don't even look at it as arm. Just train your elbows. Everyone heard like quad extensions and hamstring curls are so demonized. Like, yeah, but the shear force. It's like, dude, you put 3-meter wraps on and squat more than you can actually squat, and you're worried about shear force on a quad extension? Like, be real.
Yeah, that's funny. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Andre Hude recently. He got I believe 14th to 15th at his first CrossFit Games this year, and he was talking about the place of bodybuilding work in his program, and how since he started having a solid routine around that, all his little niggles, joint pain, all that kind of stuff has been managed really, really well. So, I hear the same from you. It's kind of general work towards the specific demands of powerlifting, and it is going to be, from a joint health standpoint and all the rest, it really has an important place to play.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that like a bicep isn't functional is from someone who doesn't understand how the bicep functions.
Yeah, exactly. I want to stay on failure, talk about failure of the mind. Has there been times when you've been stuck either on a bar or a certain movement, and you maybe knew that physically you had it in you, but just something didn't click in your mind and you just couldn't get over that hump for a certain period of time? Or have you always been able to just work through whatever you had to work through pretty quickly?
Not to be like, not to be like a tough guy or anything, but based off of like, who Roger Bannister is?
The name, yes.
So Roger Bannister is the first guy to break a 4-minute mile.
Yes, right.
And the weekend after, like 5 other guys broke the 4-minute mile. So for me, like nothing I did was ever impressive because it was literally warm up weight for the guys I lifted with. So that mental block, like I wasn't pioneering anything in the gym I trained at. Like I was just the 3rd or 4th strongest dude in the gym. So it was like, there'd be times where it would be my top set and people wouldn't even realize it. And they're like, oh, you're kind of weak. So like, it was never an issue. Like, there's still like numbers that are, it's just something just happens. Like something happens to me. And when a barbell is heavier than 700 pounds, like on my back, like 694 is easy. 704 sucks. And no more does it, like that's the shittiest 10-pound increment for me. Like I don't know a difference between 595 and 605. I have no like, wait a minute, what happened there? I could tell a difference between 694 and 704.
Yeah. What do you think that threshold is for you? Is it really just in the mind? Could you shift it progressively to, 710 or something like that?
Oh yeah. But it's like, and that's the thing, like, look, even 500 pounds is heavy. Like it doesn't, 500 pounds doesn't suck less than it did. I'm just able to just do it. Like I don't know. It's every time I lift something that I've never lifted before, it's nothing. It's not at a certain point, the lighter stuff doesn't get lighter. Like for me to think that 700 pounds is light, I'd probably have to squat like 1,000. So it's just, I don't know. It's something about the squat. I think it has a lot to do with like how much structure you have underneath. Like I've competed at 242. So like what, 110s and 125s. Most meet days I show up and I'm probably around the same weight every meet, whether I've cut for weigh-ins or whether I don't. So let's say like 117 to 120 kilos is like pretty much where I'm at anytime I'm in a competition. If I don't cut, if I do, I'll cut 7 kilos, and then by the time I'm lifting, I have that weight back on. So like my structure hasn't scaled to the same amount that my strength has. So I think that has something to do with it. It's like I still only have, I don't know, a certain percentage of my body weight is still my bones. Those bones have not grown. But when I first started powerlifting, maybe I was squatting 500, and now I'm squatting mid sevens. It's like, so I think that might be what it is. Is like I'm trying to read a threshold where it's just like I put it on my back and I actually have to adjust my rack height and be like, oh, I'm shorter now after this. Like this sucks. But yeah, 700 is one. 700 with squatting is definitely one where it's like, oh, this is terrible. But the fact that, my training partners, when I was really competitive, were doing that as like, I think I watched Andrew. Andrew squatted 804 for 5. I've spotted him for what is still the world record, 976 at 242 in the gym, which is, no one will ever do that again. And he fucking bodied it, like absolutely to the house. It was what, it would have been a Monday night. There was 8 spotters, someone on a camera. It was everyone in the gym. Of the 8 spotters, I may have had the weakest squat at 750, and you could have heard a pin drop. Like, and that's one of my favorite things about him as a lifter, is like not a sound. Everyone was so afraid, because at that point you didn't have 8 spotters. If that goes wrong, you have 8 casualties. You have 8 dead people. And yeah, he hit the 9, I think it was 976 out of a mono in wraps at 242. It was just like, this will never happen again in the history of time.
Was that the most impressive lift you've ever seen or witnessed in person?
Man, it's got to be up there. Dan's 900 beltless in the cage was really cool. I was there when Vlad Alzahov did 1117 in Australia. Most impressive. That is one that comes to mind, just because like, just the set and setting was so epic. Like, everyone was prepping for something. Maybe it was record breakers. Yeah, that's honestly, I think, yeah, his 804. I mean, Dan's sub-maximal volume stuff is crazy. Dan pulling 1,003 off 4-inch blocks was pretty wild. Anytime Jamal Browner lifts is just insane, because it's effortless. Craziest lifts I've seen. Those are up there. Those are some of like my Mount Rushmores. But I think the Herbert one's my favorite, just because it was like, not in competition, in training. Everyone was like at the top of their game, and it was just such a wild scene to play back. Like, you know, I think there was an Instagram post about it, low key, and before Herbert was really who he is now, and everyone was like, "What the fuck did we just watch?" Insane.
To finish on the mind side, so you talked about always having someone around you or as a training partner or in the gym that could, you know, outlift you, and that kind of took away your excuse for using your mind as a crutch. For the guys that are, you know, top of the game, guys, gals that are maybe the best in their gym, the best in their lifting group, you've been around those people. How do they think? Do they think differently than the call them the runner-ups, or, you know, just people that operate a little bit lower than them? How do they keep challenging themselves on the mental side to just keep pushing, even though there's maybe nobody directly in front of them to go after?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. It's them. It's no different. It's just internalized. Like, they're just nuts, and so they see something that's there that's not, and that something that's there is themselves. So it's literally the same thing. Like, my friends they're sick, like they're unwell, because they're seeing things that don't exist, and what they're seeing is themselves out in front of them that they need to beat in like a weird third person. It's cool. It's really cool to be able to witness it, because it's like, not in powerlifting anyways. Like, I'm not going to be a superlative. Like, I know the strongest people in my weight class by first name, and I'm not going to be them. But yeah, it's cool to see their ability to create that, because I think you need it. And then what they're creating is just a manifestation of themselves in front of themselves, which is really abstract.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, and I'm sure it's almost a prerequisite at that level to keep, you know, pushing forward and progressing.
You got to be insane. You have to be insane.
You have to be insane. Here you go. Switching gears a little bit. I know you worked in rugby strength and conditioning for a while. So given your experience so far, what would you change in your approach to rugby strength and conditioning? Maybe how did you approach it back then? And then how would you approach it now, where you put back in charge?
That's a good question. I guess it would depend. It would depend on like the cohort that I had. It would depend on the league that we played in. I mean, given this, it had been removed from it for a few years. I like, the deeper question is, how has my thought process evolved around rugby strength and conditioning between now and like 3-4 years ago? Probably focus more on like the aerobic side. Probably the kids are plenty strong. It's just, do you have the lungs to be strong in an hour after you've been kind of beat up? I would probably look at that, maybe more data driven. If I had the opportunity.
What data would you be leaning onto? What would you?
GPS data. If I could, I don't. When I work one-on-one with some of the NFL players now, I use like an HRV tracker. I don't think it's necessarily the be-all, end-all, but at the very least, it's consistent. So yeah, if given the opportunity, I'd probably use a little bit more data, GPS on the field. If I could get like some guys' max velocities during games, I'd probably program their sprinting and running percentages during the week off of that, more relative. Yeah, I think those are the major ones. I'd use HRV, and essentially I would use more data to drive the decision-making and program, especially in season. I think that's where you're going to make the biggest strides in like longevity, because if you can keep athletes getting better season over season, rather than only just getting better in the off season and really just ending up static, it's almost like especially now, it seems like rugby's grown, at least in North America, so much in popularity since I've sort of exited. It's almost like the idea of inflation. Like you don't want you can't afford to have the same athlete come in at the same skill level, the same conditioning, the same strength every season, because the baseline level of skill is increasing. Just like you don't want to leave all your money in the bank account, because the inflation is actually causing your money to be worth less. So it's like you want to make these investments in season so that you can actually have a credit in that account, and that athlete can come in better the following season, especially if you play on a good team and they they're ultimately just playing more than their lesser contemporaries. So I think data-driven decisions in season would probably be something I lean on a lot more, so that progression season over season can be seen. It's always difficult with a collegiate setting, because you only have them for 4 years at max. So that would be something that if you're working at like a national level or professional level, be something I would look at, because you can look at a career that'll extend much, hopefully, fingers crossed, longer than 4 years. And I think if you can start to pay attention to those metrics and start to make that investment in season, you can almost guarantee that you're going to have a player, barring any sort of catastrophic injury, be able to be relevant and better season over season.
You talked about working with some NFL players. What other sports do you work with that you maybe really enjoy, not necessarily playing yourself, but just working with because of maybe certain constraints or certain aspects that are pretty unique to that sport?
Mixed martial arts, UFC is always one that's fun to work with.
What's the biggest challenge for you there?
Regulating workload. Because I'm not a skills coach, right? Like I'm not going to take it to the mat. I'm not going to teach you how to guillotine someone. So that's where data is so important, is because not that it's predictable, more so like, if a player coach in a team setting, if someone fucks around on the bus and they got to run gassers, it's like, all right, thanks, Ben. I had this whole fucking program written, and you had to just punish them like they're children. Where there seems to be far less rhyme or reason for mixed martial art skills. I would argue, and this is like as an objective outsider, but fuck it, I've been doing this long enough where I feel confident saying this, that most UFC fighters are good in spite of what they do, not because of what they do. And I mean that from a strength and conditioning side, and I mean that from a skills coaching side. I think, not that I have it figured out, but I don't think we begin to scratch the surface of skill level in that discipline. Because I think people are just completely destroying. And you see it, right? The UFC went from 4 fights a year on these main card, Chuck Liddell, Tito Ortiz, these classic brawlers, to now it's like, mind you that all of these athletes are, they're incredible athletes, and they've earned their stripes through their different, origin stories. And I don't want to take it any away from them, but the UFC as a business has definitely increased the urgency for people to get good really quickly. And that pressure, I think, is felt down to the level of strength and conditioning. So everyone's just trying to do everything. And it's like, at the very least, they're not making them better. I would go as far to say in some cases you might be making them worse. And there's a lot of strength and conditioning principles for mixed martial arts that, people like, look, some people are just freaks. Like they're just, some athletes are going to be good in spite of what they do. And it's not a sport that lends itself to modesty. So like strength and conditioning around that field is just so funny to me, because it's the coaches also want to be the fighters. It's like, look, man, you're the guy holding the clipboard. Like, let's fucking tone it down a bit here. And they're going to be good regardless of what, the best are going to be good regardless of what you do. Not because of what you do. It's just, there's still
a huge cultural maybe evolution to take place in that sport. From that standpoint, I was talking to Andrew Usher, who works with pro boxers in Scotland, and he was kind of telling me the same thing. He tries to have a very close to what you said, data-driven approach in terms of making sure they get the right training load and making sure they're fresh when they get to competition day. I think he said his fighter was a little bit under when he did his cut, but he was great and rehydrated up, and he was totally fine. But then Andrew, I think the manager or somebody else came to him and he said, why was he under? Why was he not just at his weight? Why was he, half a pound below? And Andrew said, the guy won the fight. He had a great fight. He was in top shape, but he was 0.5 under. Like, who cares? That's not what matters. But the other person said, no, he has to be right at the limit, because otherwise that's not a good weight cut.
Yeah, at that point, you just tell them to go fuck themselves, right? Like that's.
I think that's what Andrew said.
That's where we're at. No, because it's so frustrating. Because, like, the only sport I played very competitively was ice hockey and powerlifting to that extent. I am way better at programming for sports I've never played, because I have no inherent bias.
Yeah,
I don't care. These are the positions you're in. These are the principles that drive human adaptation. This is the resting state of you while you're doing these things. There you go. That's exercise program. I don't care. So it's like, it is something that it seems like in combat sports, the strength conditioning always seems to be driven by someone who used to do the sport, and it's so laden and riddled with biases. Like the idea that you're going to punch a landmine and your landmine presses are going to increase your punching power is like, what? Are you fucking joking me? What universe is that? How the human, like, no. So it's just, I like mixed martial arts because it can be, if you get an open-minded athlete, you can allow them to just be so much more skillful, because you can put their strength and conditioning in perspective. Like, I get, and look, there's some guys, again, like kind of the psychology point around powerlifters. There's some guys, the only way that they're fighting is if they feel like they're fighting for their life, and you have to kill them. And that's fine, man. Like, and that's something that you as a coach need to recognize. And that's why I'm a strength and conditioning coach, not a strength and conditioning programmer, because you coach an athlete and you program a computer. But I think you'd be so much better off being able to send them into their skill work, not completely fucking haggard. And their skill is going to ultimately be and we're seeing this now, right? Like back in Liddell, Tito Ortiz, the heyday of early UFC, they were fucking brawlers. Like, they weren't as skilled as, like Israel Adesanya or Francis Ngannou. Like, these guys are tacticians. What's his name? Probably one of Anderson Silva. Like, Anderson Silva, I think, was a really pivotal athlete, and probably the most influential, whether people realize it or not, probably one of the most influential UFC fighters of all time, because he, to me, was the indicator that the tone has shifted. You can't be, right? Like, you can't be a brawler anymore, because this guy's just going to fucking ruin your life. Like, if you try to, he's just going to have an answer for you. Like, so I think, he was a signal to people. It's like, oh, like, skill matters. So that should be, it's like, if I trained Brock Lesnar, it's like, all right, let's fucking go. And let's just do a bunch of meathead shit. Why? Because you're just going to drop your shoulder and run the guy into the parking lot. Because it's like, all right, that's how you're going to win. But now it's like, if you got to prepare for style bender, it's like, dude, I'm going to send him to his skills guy as fresh as a fucking daisy. We're going to do, maybe some complex stuff, make sure his aerobic capacity is increasing. And that's it. Because it's like, Lord help you going into the ring with that fucking guy. So I think it's just such an interesting subculture.
Yeah. And you still see many years of, development until athletes actually reach their full potential in that discipline.
There are certain strength coaches who just need to cease to exist for this to be broken. Because it's like, dude, it's the tap out t-shirt of strength conditioning. It's like, I think you left some of your affliction shirt rhinestones on the gym floor, you fuck. Like, there's just so much. I mean, how could it not be an ego-driven sport where it's like, if I lose a hockey game, I'm going to say, I'm going to take my skates off. If I lose a fight, I'm lying bloody in my own filth in the middle of a cage while the whole world watches. Like, I understand how ego could be tied into it, but it's like, when you're in a gym, you're not going to war. Believe it or not. You're not storming Normandy, man. Like, you're just fucking in a gym trying to make an athlete a little bit better so they can go into another gym and be better there again at the skill that they're actually going to get tested on. So it's like, one of my favorite strength coaches is a Canadian dude named Matt Nickel. He was with the Toronto Maple Leafs kind of in their heyday, the early 2000s, where they arguably had, they were consistently playoff contenders. It's probably some of the most recognizable Maple Leaf players, characters in the last 50 years played while he was there. And he was a football guy. Matt Nickel loved football, played football. And he walks in and hockey players are not impressive human beings, like, at all. Like, they're just guys. Like, they look like your bank teller. Like, that's what pro hockey players look like. And now in the early 2000s, that was a little bit different. Now it's definitely gone more skill-based, as most things have, because it's just more entertaining of the sport. But yeah, that's like, I had no bias, because I just walked in as a football guy. I was like, what the fuck are these guys doing? They're like running around with butter knives on their feet. Like, this is crazy. How do I program for this? It's like, all right, back to the science, strip all your bias. Like, I don't care to be a better hockey. I don't even think Matt Nickel at the time could skate. He was dealing with $80-90 million of assets annually, and he couldn't skate, and it didn't fucking matter, right? He could lift weights. He knew how to move. He trained. He was jacked. He was strong. He was fast, but he wasn't a hockey player. And then that, I think, made him a better strength coach. Right? Not that, like, people who play the sport can't be, but it's like, you have to be able to remove the ego. And I just think the ego is so ingrained into the sport of mixed martial arts or UFC because of the ramifications of getting it wrong. How could it not be, right? There's no helmet. There's no 7 other guys on there, 11 other guys on the field, or 12 other guys, or 10 other guys, or 4 other guys. It's just you getting the shit kicked out of you. So it's like, I get it, but at the same time, it's like, the stuff that comes out of mixed martial arts strength conditioning is incredibly entertaining.
Yeah. And so maybe it's going to be a delayed evolution. I mean, I see a parallel to what you're saying in rugby world, where 10, 15 years ago, it was kind of just, beat your head against the wall until it hurts. And then when it bleeds, you just keep going. And that was kind of the strength and conditioning approach of many coaches. And unfortunately, sometimes even still today, some skills coaches maybe don't have the knowledge or the perspective to maybe approach it differently. And, if we're able to come so far in rugby world, hopefully we can do that in MMA as well in the coming years, right?
Yeah, they're similar in a sense that, like, you need to, not that you don't have to do this in other sports. It's like baseball. Like, baseball's a fucking joke. But you need to take into consideration recovery from the actual sport itself. I mean, baseball pitchers, sure, but if you're a fucking left fielder, you're picking daisies. Like, you're fucking picking daisies. You're not doing fuck all, right? So it's like, the fact that was probably a missing link was like, it's not just, like, stress is an aggregation, or it's an aggregate. It's a summative value across many different indices. So it's like, we need to understand that how we rank order these indexes is going to drastically affect our decision-making process in the gym. And you should rank order the game itself very, very high when
Yeah.
you are dealing with like such high aerobic, well, just high sympathetic drive, period.
Mm.
Like if I'm looking down the barrel of some fucking kid from Tonga and I got the rock, I am stressed out of my fucking gourd.
As you should be.
Right. Yeah. This like Polynesian kid's going to rip my fucking head off coming over center. It's like, fuck that. And it's the same with UFC. Like I would work with guys post fight and I wouldn't work with them for 2 weeks because it's like, we don't know what's happening.
Mm.
Like I've been in car accidents before where my shoulder didn't start to hurt till 2 weeks after. You, my friend, were in a car accident. It wasn't a Corolla. It was a guy with the red trunks in the other corner. Like that was your car accident. So yeah, you just understanding like the sympathetic stress of the sport and the ramifications that that has on recovery and how that has an impact on performance is like we're a long ways away.
Yeah, I'm with you there, Jordan. We're getting to the end of our time here. I've got a couple quick ending questions for you if you have the minutes.
Yeah, let's do it.
Fantastic. And they both come from our Instagram followers. The first one is, and that could probably be the topic for a full podcast, but I'll ask you to condense it as short as you can. What is the place of breathing for you in human biomechanics?
Ooh, it's home base, right? Breathing and gait cycle are the two defining characteristics of our evolved function, right? Ventilation and gait are home base. So we should just be able to touch home base. Right? Mm-hmm. So breathing has huge implications in our biochemistry, but how the breathing affects, the static position of the rib cage, and static is probably the wrong way to word it, is like we make special training considerations around Q angle and carrying angle and neutral scapular plane. We should probably make a consideration around this giant thing, which a bunch of shit attaches onto as a consequence of the way our diaphragm has, most efficiently chose to get oxygen into our body. So I think from a biomechanics perspective, breathing has huge implications on your exercise selection, exercise execution, but more importantly, I think the range of normal that's accepted based off of different body types as those body types have adapted from their genetic expression and then through their training, through sport, adopted an epigenetic expression. We can tell a lot about someone's biases and compensations in movement by the way that they present in different phases of ventilation, the way that chronic not necessarily having a negative effect, just indicating use over time. The chronic positions and postures we adopt as a manifestation of those breathing biases and compensation should allow us to understand the roadmap back to home base, right? Where can we get a ribcage stacked over our pelvis? Where can we learn to rotate better? And just go touch it and train there a little bit, because on the field of play, we're not going to be stacked. Right? We're going to be wrist twisted and contorted and extended and all of the above at the same time, but just being able to come back to home base. So I think understanding breathing biomechanics is to understand how to get someone back to that home base position, that safe mode. It's not where we have to live. It's not where we should live. It's not where sports live. But being able to know our way back is very effective means to decrease, some sort of systemic stress and training.
Nice summary. Good job making it short. Second and last one, again from a follower, and I thought it was an interesting question for you. What are the limitations of your model? If we take Pre-Script level 1, level 2, what limitations do you see as still being part of your own model?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because you don't know what you don't know. I don't necessarily think that we have. I don't think I teach a model. I think I teach principles. So the limitations are in application. I think that's everyone's limitation, is like doing the damn thing. That's a tough one. I honestly have to think about it, because if I thought there was a limitation, I would probably teach the way around that limitation. And I try to make sure that the curriculum that we put out is principles focused. It's really not like a cut and dry, like we're going to do this scoring system, and then if you do this, you do that. It's it's more of a systems way of thinking,
Mm.
and rather than like an algorithm. Like it is very much principles focused. It's like, hey, here's what the body does. Have fun. Like that's, and maybe that's its limitation. The limitation in the model is in how it gets applied.
Mm.
And I think the course, like the goal of the course isn't to give people answers, it's to help them ask better questions. So I think really it ends up being at the end user, how the interpretation of those principles carry themselves into decisions they make day to day with their training and the training of their athletes. So that's a really shitty answer, but it's all I got.
I'll try to throw you a better question so you can maybe give a
I'm
better
gonna redeem
answer.
myself.
Redeem yourself on that last one. So maybe what questions are you asking yourself right now in your own education process? What blind spots are you trying to address? What things are you digging into right now?
Digging into more like functional applications around the nervous system. You know, the level 2 we finish about talking about the cerebellum and basically how to make decisions on the 3 functional subcomponents of like our movement brain. And we don't go too deep into like the inner workings of cerebellar function. I don't think we do, relative to most training we do, because we talk about it. But it's about creating an understanding and a way to rank order exercise parameters to make cumulative adaptations around the way that the brain actually learns. Like the cerebellum is what drives motor learning. So, and it's also responsible for our overall resting tone. It's one thing I've learned from working with like very, very good athletes is that, you know, the resting heart rate is usually lower. From a palpatory standpoint, their muscle tone is usually much more, and I hate to use the word, but like we see it all the time. And like, you know, there was a reason people liked the title Supple Leopard for Kelly Starrett. There's a reason that the marketing team at TB12 used pliability. It's because those are 2 terms that indicate a decrease in overall tone, which is regulated by the cerebellum. So a lot of my, you know, with the athletes that I'm working with, a lot of the consideration, especially now that we're moving, what day is it? We're a few weeks out from the regular season for the NFL. A lot of the considerations are around, you know, modulating and managing resting tone, which is going to be something that we can access through the 3 functional subcomponents of the cerebellum. So just understanding like how the fuck do we do that is like a whole lot of fun, because it's funny that like, you know, that one example of pliability, supple this and all that, like that term, you know, malleability, we like that. Like we don't know why we like it, but we understand it, and we can see how they're consistent in their thought process. So to understand the mechanism which allows for that to occur really opens up a ton of options in training, and it gives a whole new reference point to scaling and indexing, or indexing and scaling exercise, which is like a ton of fun, because it just, you know, not that I think it's the be all end all, but you know, there's only so much insertion, origin, muscle action, muscle function stuff that you can talk about before we start to have to ask bigger questions. But bigger questions don't need bigger answers. And I think that's where the fun stuff comes in. It's just like, I've increased hip mobility in athletes just by having them not look in the mirror when they squat. How? Well, it's like you now need to take your insertion, origin, muscle function, you know, triplanar model and put that on the back burner and start to move a little bit deeper into mapping the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. And that's like a whole lot of fun, because you can come up with a very sophisticated, simple answer to a question that its underlying mechanism is so unbelievably complex. And that's the beauty of this, is like, I find that in like hypertrophy or aesthetic, sometimes even athletic, like the answer can be a little bit complicated. Like, oh, we're going to try and do this force plate ground contact time. We're going to be, you know, trying to make these tendinous adaptations and or stiffness and all of this. And, you know, we're going to use different surfaces, where it's like, that's oof, man, they got the chains on the bands and the parachute. That's an interesting one. Where it's like with the nervous system, it itself is so elegant. Are you a watch guy?
I'm not a watch guy. But go for it anyway.
No, but like watches they just tell the time. Like it's so stupid. I don't even look at this thing. I just fucking look at my phone. But the mechanism behind it is so complicated. Like I have to wind this bitch every day. I love it. It's my favorite thing on the planet. And you can see all the inner workings of it. Like it's got the back of it. And the reason I like it is because you can just see like this thing will never die because there's no battery. Like it's just so fucking cool. Like I get why. It just tells me the time. That's the only thing it does. It's just like, hey, it's 9:30. But it's so simple. And that's what I like about it, is because it's so unbelievably complex, but the answer it gives you is so simple. And the nervous system is a lot like that, where it's like we're chimpanzees with universes for brains. And sometimes my answer to an athlete's problem is don't look in the mirror. There's a really long, complicated gears, wires, and shit answer to why that is. But if you can understand the mechanism and you know when to manipulate these exercise parameters based off of like understanding how all these gears work, and you can make such a quick adaptation by just like making a consideration back to the central nervous system, it's so fucking cool. So that's kind of where I'm spending a lot of my time. It's just, using my athletes as guinea pigs to see if we can make them marginally better by just making considerations around the central nervous system.
Yeah, I like it. Jordan, for people who don't follow you yet, where can they find out more about your work, about your programs, about your podcast?
Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. It's RX'd RADIO, RX''D. Our education can be found at www.pre-script.com. Instagram is at @the_muscle_doc.
Thanks so much for coming on the show today, man. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome, man. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Yeah.